Good morning everyone, thank you for joining us on our SoftwareONE webinar today on SQL Server Avoiding the Fiscal Cliff. My name is David Blocks, I'm the Marketing Manager at SoftwareONE and joined today by one of our Senior Licensing Specialists, Tony McElworth. So before we go into the main part of today's session, I just want to run through a few housekeeping rules. So we are on mute. I've set everyone to mute this to ensure that the sound level and audio remains at an optimum for your viewing pleasure, but we will have some time at the end of today for a bit of Q&A, so please use the chat box facility on your screen, on your panel, to send us your questions or anything that sort of springs to mind through the content, and then at the end we'll have some time to address any of those questions. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Tony to go through today's content.
Morning everybody. Thanks for the introduction, Dave. I am a Senior Licensing Specialist for SoftwareONE in the UK. My role is to advise our customers on the optimum way to procure software, and this, as always, is a combination of various factors. And the focus of today is to explore how to best procure and optimize SQL Server for your organization's requirements. As you may be aware, Microsoft did move SQL Server over from a processor licensing metric to a per core licensing metric. And while that on the surface may seem to align with other large vendors and how they've approached scaling their commercial licensing models, nonetheless it can have a financial impact for yourselves, which we are deeming the fiscal cliff. And the objective really of today's webinar is to outline some of the areas that could potentially see an increase in cost, how we look to mitigate the associated risks of the per core world, and we evaluate the impact for organizations that are looking at 2012, but also those organizations that still deploy N-1 or N-2 technologies, whether that's SQL 2008 R2 or SQL 2008. So just moving forward, in terms of sort of the overview of what we're going to go through, obviously I'm going to give a brief overview of the processor to per core licensing model. I'm going to touch on the much misunderstood and often feared area of the licensing metrics pertaining to virtualization of SQL. I'm thinking of those organizations who have deployed SQL in a VMware environment, for instance. I'll be touching on the role of software assurance, which is Microsoft's maintenance program, and why increasingly for organizations this is being seen as critical in their risk analysis and mitigation work when evaluating the renewal of software procurement contracts, and why this could be essential for your organization for your current and planned future SQL deployments. I'll be giving examples of how the SQL can lead to a fiscal cliff, what that fiscal cliff looks like for organizations we're talking to, and obviously I'll give you some ideas of how we've approached this with our existing customers. Finally, I wanted to touch base on how organizations are looking to enable their license grants. As always, many vendors look to support and their existing clients who have committed to their maintenance programs by allowing them to migrate from a prior release to a new release, and this is all the more important when changing metrics. So without further ado, I'll kind of kick off. So first of all, I just brought up a summary tab here. All this is really there to illustrate is the fact that Microsoft have chosen to consolidate their licensing SKU lineup across editions for the 2012 release. In a nutshell, Data Center was consolidated into Enterprise Edition. Business Intelligence Edition is a new player in the middle ground and is something we encounter less in our customers, and this has to be very selectively reviewed as to whether this makes sense, although it could potentially be commercially more viable if the elements of the technology make sense for you. And of course, Standard Edition continues. So we're down to a 3 SKU lineup. Microsoft have consolidated. Data Center is now in Enterprise. And that's essentially what I want to focus on today. I'm not going to go into the deep dive into the technological differences between the editions. I'm going to focus on the licensing and how licensing can impact your technology choice, not just the functionality. So just plan moving over to the next slide now. So this is something I pulled together. This is essentially a timeline of some notable events. And you'll see I'm focusing on 2 trends if you're kind of reading between the lines. A, Microsoft have increased the price of SQL. B, Microsoft increasing prices generally. And so for many organizations that signed a contract 18 months, 2 years ago, they're going to be seeing themselves exiting their current committed contract into a new world. And it's going to be a new world where they're going to potentially see price hikes, and they're going to be looking to exit that contract in the best position possible or renew into the best negotiated position possible. And that's kind of where we come in. You can see there that since the general availability of SQL 2008 R2, Microsoft started to increase price on SQL. But they did other interesting things like essentially moving concepts like license mobility, which was enshrined within the license element, and moving over into maintenance. So another potential impact isn't just the price increases from Microsoft, but it's also the software use rights that they previously enshrined in an enterprise license is now enshrined within a maintenance element. So you can see how Microsoft is trying to encourage corporate behaviors to renew their maintenance contracts through large agreements like the enterprise agreement or the enrollment for application platform. And the reason for that is that customers want to continue to leverage the software and use it the way they have been using it, and they don't want to lose that ability to reassign licenses faster than 90 days. So if you're looking at a vMotion enabled environment, high availability, or even you've just had a look at your data logs and you realize that some of those servers are moving around more than once in 90 days across a few hosts, you're going to see potentially a driver to maintain that relationship with Microsoft. July 1st last year, Microsoft did about a 30% price increase in the UK. So SoftwareONE have been working very hard with our customers to mitigate that, and there's various areas we look at holistically to save our customers money. So touching on the licensing metrics, for Enterprise Edition, Microsoft have concentrated into a single metric, which is essentially per core. And I'll go into detail on how they handle that. However, it's a per core licensing metric. So if you think at a very high level, if you were previously buying 2 processor licenses for your box, and Microsoft essentially equated that pricing based on 1 processor equals 4 cores. However, like many of our customers who are saying to us, no, wait, we've got 8 cores, 16 cores in that box, 32 cores in that box. Our customers are seeing anything from a 400% price increase just looking at it at that high level. So it's increasingly important to understand how the licensing metrics come into play, and that's what we tend to deep dive into our customers to look at a granular level to advise you on the optimum way to procure. Business Intelligence Edition is maintained on a server and client access license model. So the idea being that you have the server, but you still have that obligation to license for each user, whether internal or external, that may directly or indirectly access the services of that product. And increasingly, I think the Business Intelligence Edition is under threat, especially with the extension of Microsoft's terminology around multiplexing, how there may be less and less chance to actually license on a client access license model if your internal servers you would normally deem to be internal, the vendor actually deems to be facing the public at large. So it depends on your business model and your structure, your organization and your processes, but nonetheless it's something that's worth evaluating with SoftwareONE. Standard Edition, they maintain both options, and it's something that's going to be down to understanding whether or not what's more economical for your organization. Just to confirm, we will be ensuring that this presentation will be made available to all attendees. So if you want to take a look at this at your own time in reference to some other guidance documentation, and we can kind of go through it. I am aware that I'm going through this at quite a fast pace. So moving on to the next slide, this is how Microsoft handles SQL core licensing when you've deployed SQL in a physical operating system environment. So starting off with the simplest area first. Microsoft mandate a minimum of 4 core licenses. They're sold in packs of 2. So be aware that when you're getting a quote, you're not accidentally doubling up what your requirements are. Always sanity check that it's for the actual number of cores you require, and therefore the licenses quantities match that in packs of 2 ratio. In terms of licensing all the physical cores, Microsoft are now looking ever increasingly at the underlying hardware infrastructure more than they ever have done. And Microsoft introduced, like other vendors, looking at the processors, the CPUs themselves, and for instance, as an example, they would factor in that some chip manufacturers will tend to have a higher core density, so it's worthwhile checking this always updating factor table to understand that as you change your hardware infrastructure, this can actually impact your licensing. So the SQL DBA is going to stick SQL on a 32-core box. It's worth checking the impact before that goes live, especially if Microsoft is sniffing around and having a look at your server infrastructure. So kind of key takeaways on the initial introduction to this is that if you were to just count the underlying physical infrastructure and where SQL could sit or could potentially sit in your estate, what's that going to look like as a worst case scenario? And then can we start looking at risk, mitigating that risk and optimizing? And there's a stack of areas we can look at. Customers who signed an enterprise agreement a couple of years ago or got a current one now prior to the release of 2012, they're going to have that longer runway, which means that they have the ability to buy SQL Enterprise Edition on a per server licensing metric. But importantly, it's worth evaluating whether or not that continues to be economical or even viable for your organization. I cannot stress enough that the opportunity to license SQL on a server-based model is under threat if there is any chance that those servers are exposed to the outside world. And you don't want to be in that position of suddenly finding that your Enterprise Edition, even if the legacy ones, 2008 or 2008 R2, can no longer be leveraged. So if you want to continue to leverage that investment, absolutely get us involved so we can protect that as much as possible, or at least advise you on the exposed risk. So importantly, I just want to cover quickly that any of your 2008 R2 licenses with active software assurance can be upgraded to 2012. So let's say Enterprise Edition can be upgraded to 2012, but still maintain that server-based licensing metric. And of course, as I said, we work with customers to ensure license grants are available. So if you've got processors with software assurance assigned, we will ensure you get the best grant possible, but more importantly, only renew what you need. So lock in your license grant, renew what you need to. So I wanted to touch on SQL virtualization. This is probably the most hated area of Microsoft licensing, and even a lot of large account resellers don't particularly like getting involved with it, but it is critical in saving you money holistically. It's the highest risk area, even more than anything you could see on the desktop. So I said I was going to explain a little bit more about the per core licensing in a virtual environment. In a nutshell, for Enterprise Edition, Microsoft offer 2 methods. A, you can license all the physical hardware, all those physical cores that SQL sits on, and you license that with software assurance. So you would buy Enterprise Edition on a per core model, licensing all the physical cores, and it's with software assurance. So you're going to be locking yourself into that relationship with Microsoft. The advantage of that is unlimited virtual machines with SQL. So you don't have to have a scalable count to ensure that you have licensing capacity as your VM density increases and virtualized SQL starts to impact that cost. On the flip side, Microsoft gives the option to license by the virtual cores assigned to individual virtual machines. So essentially you license the VMs themselves. If you have software assurance on them, that enables license mobility. So as I said, Microsoft very astutely moved license mobility from the license itself, which was enshrined in Enterprise Edition 2008 and 2008 R2, and flipped it into the maintenance element, software assurance, upon general availability of SQL 2012. So it's worthwhile looking at this in tandem, looking at your legacy estate, understanding you can maintain those legacy server licenses assigned to where you want them to be assigned, and you can have them reassigned under the original license mobility rules, or looking at license mobility in the new 2012 world. The choice between these two metrics overall is going to be a financial one, and it's going to be looking at your technical reality for your environment. So we'll help you do that. Standard edition is just on the individual virtual machine level. Cheaper license, you can buy SA, assign it to the virtual cores supporting that VM, and then it will move around in a high availability environment if you have that software assurance assigned. I wanted to touch on the per server licensing model. The reason being that quite simply that it's one virtual machine equates to one server license. So you can see how that scales up. So high virtualized virtual environments will likely start to favor the core model. And also, as I said, you're going to have to evaluate whether or not a server and client access license model is suitable or viable in your organization if you have to license every user or any potential external user under potentially the client access license model. So it may be putting you unwittingly under the per core metric, whether you like it or not. Just wanted to touch on license mobility as I discussed over the last couple of slides. License mobility, in essence, tends to have been moved from the license itself into maintenance by Microsoft over the last couple of years. It's more than likely that any server license you want to move, if you want to move it more than once in a 90-day period, or even reassign it at all, it's going to be something you're going to have to procure with software assurance going forward. So that's what Microsoft did with SQL. The advantages for a high mobility virtual environment. The other advantage is that Microsoft introduced something called license mobility through software assurance. It sounds the same, but essentially what they're referring to is the ability to move your SQL workloads to a third-party private cloud provider under the software use rights of your software assurance. This is worthwhile looking into if you're buying a private hosted service, and making sure that that provider is leveraging your existing licensing investment. I would say that this latter option, to move it to a third-party private cloud, that service provider must be on an approved list from Microsoft. The reason being is that they want to make sure that all those private cloud providers are playing ball and paying them all, making sure that they're not mis-licensing or under-licensing any of their customers or pocketing the difference. So it's a trusted list, and it will require that private cloud provider to illustrate to Microsoft what servers they're running on your behalf and the associated licensing agreement you're using to support that. However, that said, great enabler to enable you to leverage your existing licensing and maintenance investment. So my fancy diagram here, borrowed from elements of VMware diagrams, is illustrating SQL moving in a virtual machine across a high vMotion-enabled environment. First thing Microsoft are going to ask you if they ever get on the phone is, are you virtualizing SQL? Do you have VMware? Is it in a vMotion-enabled environment? If the answers to those are yes, they are going to be all over you to try and get details of this so that they can compare that against your existing license and maintenance footprint. In a nutshell, to enable full vMotion, there is an option to license by individual VMs, and that will be balanced against the latter option, which is to license the whole underlying physical infrastructure for SQL Enterprise Edition with SA, which is exemplified in the next slide. So in this slide, it's illustrating licensing by physical hardware. You have a license with software assurance. It enables you to have that highest density possible, and that's what Microsoft's objective really is. They want every piece of your stack licensed for the maximum enabled use rights leverage under the maintenance. So there you go. So instead of sort of next steps, sort of how we approach this as an organization, to put it mildly, we're systematic. We combine various areas, which is software asset management. So we have a global software asset management practice that do this work all around the world. We're very experienced, and we have some very large clients that we do it for. And the important thing is a discovery tool can only go so far. So a discovery tool won't necessarily ask all the questions that's important to a vendor that informs their licensing metrics and ultimately the cost to your organization or risk to your organization. So the answer will not be collected necessarily by one tool alone. It's going to need that intelligence behind it, and that's where our software asset management team and licensing analysts come into play. It's everything from the physical hardware up all the way to the top end, which is the final negotiation strategy on your procurement contract. We can start wherever you are in that process yourself and assist you, but ultimately to minimize the cost of your server estate, I can't stress enough how important it is to kind of touch and look at every one of these elements from the bottom up, down from the physical hardware infrastructure to the virtualization layer, to your clustering configurations, to the products you've got installed versus the licensing and rights you have associated to support that installation, the components or options you may or may not have enabled, whether you choose to deploy that on an on-premise, private, hybrid, public cloud, is it high availability, is vMotion enabled, everything, all that comes into play. And then finally, where our core sort of expertise and IP as a large account reseller is that we have access to procurement contracts, price lists across the world. We can advise you on technology consolidation, how to consolidate that post-discovery phase, how to optimize your choice of editions and versions in your organization aligned to your existing licensing footprint. And then finally, of course, we look at negotiation strategy seriously. So if you think about it, there's no way at the end of it you're not coming out with a clear idea of your exposed risk and how to optimize. And, you know, I can go into all the detail of it, but ultimately I want to give you that overview, and we can kind of go into it for your bespoke environment if you want to. In terms of just touching on the license grants, because I know that's probably something a lot of organizations just want to sanity check. If you think about it, Microsoft equated 4 cores to 1 processor. So that's what they'll give you when your SA expires unless you do something. And that license grant, don't expect it to necessarily show up on any of Microsoft's VLSC. They might start doing it, but for the basic level, based on that, that equivalent license grant based on the licenses. But you don't want to be what Microsoft can't do as a vendor is necessarily make you retrospectively non-compliant as much as they would like to. So this is essentially where it comes in to make sure that you get the licenses you need prior to the expiration of your agreement. If you think about it, if you've got a 16-core box, you currently got it licensed for 2 processor licenses. At the end of the contract, you don't want 8 core licenses when you've got a 16-core box. So what Microsoft have advised is to use something called the Microsoft Map Toolkit. I think you need a little bit more than that, and you need probably a software asset management team from Microsoft to help you with it. My understanding is it won't necessarily pick up all the information that might be pertinent, but that's what they advise, and what you will need at the end of it is time and date stamped inventory of all your machines that SQL touches that covers all the possible vendor licensing metrics. And if you have that, then you can point to that forever and say, that's why I get my license grant from Microsoft, that's why I have a software assurance footprint, and that's why you can't see underlying base licenses for it. If you don't do it and then you buy SA, or you don't keep hold of that proof, at some point Microsoft might come in the future and say, hey, where are your licenses? And they're not going to remember that this is what you did unless you have proof for it. So this is about proof of license, not proof of purchase. So in terms of sort of some final thoughts, have you maximized your license grant? A lot of organizations are looking at this, but my recommendation is get it done. You've got free licenses on the table. Make sure you get them, but then have a look at how you can optimize your renewal. Because just because you want to get your free licenses to make sure you're not non-compliant retrospectively, equally you may not want to renew that whole license footprint with maintenance, because otherwise you're going to see a cost hike at the expiration of your contract. And that's even forgetting the fact that there's been general price increases across product and prices anyway. We'd like to look at renewal strategy. Most large account resellers will look at high level licensing. I think it needs to look a little bit more granular these days to make sure you get it. From a technology perspective, we look at the features you may actually need. So just because you got it deployed, I guess that there's that that tendency to install the best and latest, and maybe it's worthwhile in that cost-saving exercise to look at that at a more granular level. So ultimately, yeah, that's what we do. I just want to give you a quick overview of how we align this within our services. I promise you this isn't a sales pitch, but it gives you a good idea of how a top-end LAR should be approaching this. So what we do is we look at discover and managing what that database sprawl is, understanding your underlying infrastructure, and the structure of how your infrastructure is organized. From that, we can evaluate that exposed risk and make advisements on how to optimize your environment. So we're looking at software asset management and discovery, metering, technology evaluation through our teams, and then finally the sort of pièce de résistance, which is our licensing, product licensing, and contract optimization, procurement optimization skills, and that's where we are definitely miles above in the field. I know I rush through that very quickly. SQL licensing is not uncomplex. I know you're probably thinking about, how does this work in my environment? What if I do it this way? We're more than happy to sit down and have a sort of a face-to-face and kind of whiteboard this out. I'm more than happy to make sure that we have a copy of this presentation that can go out. Not official guidance, but I also have my own personal licensing blog at www.microsoftlicensereview.com. This is not SoftwareONE, but it does have a lot of content on it that may be some background reading. However, as always, refer to your product use rights, your product list, and your relevant contract documents for reference.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Tony. Thank you for taking us through today's content. So we've had a couple of comments through with regards to will the slides be available. So yes, so after this I will circulate the slides and also a link to Tony's independent blog as well. So it's a really, really useful reference and information site that Tony puts together and tries to help simplify and interpret the announcements that come from Microsoft. So well worth having a look at that. So if there aren't any more questions, then we'll wrap up now. So thank you very much for your time today. We have recorded today's session as well, so I understand there were a couple of audio challenges with today's session, so hopefully the recording is more improved in that respect, and we'll make that available later on today for yourselves to review at your own pace and potentially circulate with other colleagues who'd be interested in today's content. So thank you very much, Tony, and thank you to everyone else for joining us again. Cheers.